It seemed good to me and the Holy Ghost that in 2024 we're on victory's shore. We're still there.
In a stunning turn of events, televangelist Kenneth Copeland was seen collapsing in court after hearing his sentence. The courtroom, usually reserved for legal battles, was filled with shock and disbelief as the well-known pastor, known for his controversial wealth and teachings, crumbled under the weight of his fate. What happened in those final moments? How did the judge's words bring the mighty Copeland to his knees? The world is watching. This could change everything. Don't miss the shocking details. The courtroom was eerily quiet, the air heavy with tension. It was a moment that no one, not even the most seasoned legal professionals, could have predicted. Kenneth Copeland, the televangelist known for his charismatic presence and larger-than-life persona, stood before the judge, awaiting the sentencing that would determine the fate of his future. His face, usually brimming with confidence and the kind of self-assuredness that had made him a household name for decades, was now a mask of nervous anticipation. The judge's words hung in the air like a weight no one in the room could escape. The charges had been made clear: fraud, tax evasion, and the misappropriation of millions in donations from his loyal followers. These were not just accusations, they were the reality of the life Kenneth Copeland had built on promises of prosperity and divine favor. And now, it seemed, those promises were about to come crashing down. Copeland stood motionless, as if bracing himself for what was to come, but no one could have prepared him for the truth that was about to be spoken. As the judge delivered the verdict, the room was struck with a silence so intense it felt as if the world had paused. The gravity of the sentence, 20 years in federal prison, was a blow that left everyone breathless. In an instant, Copeland's expression shifted. The man who had preached about faith, about divine wealth and protection, was no longer standing tall with the authority of a preacher. Instead, he looked small, almost fragile, like a man who realized too late that he had been living in a world of his own making. His knees buckled, and without warning, he collapsed to the floor. The room erupted in chaos. People rushed to his side, calling for help, but in that moment, nothing could shield him from the harsh reality of his situation. Copeland, once a towering figure in the world of televangelism, now lay on the cold, unforgiving courtroom floor. His hands trembled, and his face, usually the epitome of unwavering faith, was twisted with fear and disbelief. Security rushed in to assist, and his legal team scrambled to shield him from the growing swarm of reporters and onlookers. But it was clear: Kenneth Copeland, the man who had once built an empire on the promise of wealth and success, was no longer in control. The man who had preached to millions about divine favor had now become the embodiment of a broken man. The collapse wasn't just physical, it was the collapse of a life built on lies and deception, a life that had now come to a brutal, undeniable end. In the midst of the chaos, the room fell silent once again, as people struggled to come to terms with what they had just witnessed. The once vibrant preacher, who had been so full of life and confidence, was now left with nothing but the consequences of his actions. His fall from grace, in that single moment, was not just a personal defeat, it was a public spectacle, a reminder of how even the most powerful can be brought to their knees. For years, Kenneth Copeland had built his empire, one donation at a time, under the guise of spreading faith and prosperity. His network of loyal followers, millions strong, trusted him as a messenger of divine wealth and blessings. He preached the prosperity gospel, a message that promised riches and success to those who had enough faith and were willing to sow into his ministry. His sermons were filled with hope, his words wrapping his audience in the comforting notion that wealth was a sign of God's favor. But behind the glossy, well-polished image Copeland had cultivated, there were whispers. Whispers of financial misconduct. Whispers of a man whose extravagant lifestyle was funded by the very people he claimed to serve. It all started slowly, with small rumors here and there. Some said that Copeland's lavish lifestyle was too much, that his private jets, expensive cars, and sprawling estates were not in line with the humble life of a man of God. Others whispered that something didn't add up, that the donations he received weren't being used to spread the word of God, as he had promised. But for the longest time, these whispers were drowned out by his booming voice and the unwavering faith of his followers. Copeland had mastered the art of convincing people that anything said against him was simply a product of jealousy or misunderstanding. He was, after all, the embodiment of divine success, the living proof that faith could bring unimaginable wealth. But as the years went on, the allegations began to pile up. It was no longer just whispers in the corners of his ministry. It was real, undeniable evidence. Investigators had started digging into the inner workings of Copeland's empire, and what they found would stun the world. It wasn't just the opulent mansions and private jets that were raising suspicions. No, the real issue lay in how Copeland was using the money donated by his followers. According to federal investigators, millions of dollars in donations had been funneled into accounts that weren't associated with the ministry at all. Instead of going toward the outreach programs, the mission work, and the supposed charity that Copeland's followers had been promised, that money was being used to fund his extravagant personal lifestyle. There were offshore accounts, hidden assets, and secret investments that nobody had known about until now. The first bombshell dropped when a former accountant from Copeland Ministries came forward with damning evidence. She had worked closely with Copeland's financial team and had first-hand knowledge of how things worked behind the scenes. According to her testimony, it was standard practice within the ministry to reclassify personal expenses as ministry costs to avoid scrutiny. Private jets, luxury cars, and even vacations were disguised as necessary expenses for the ministry. But the reality was far different. The money wasn't going to spreading the gospel. It was going straight into Copeland's pockets. Another former employee took the stand, telling the court about how Copeland had used his influence to manipulate his staff and keep anyone from questioning the finances. It wasn't just about the money, the former employee testified. It was about control. If you asked too many questions, if you pushed too hard to understand where the money was going, you were out. You were silenced. There were stories of intimidation, of employees being blacklisted from the industry if they spoke out, of people who were so afraid of losing their jobs that they turned a blind eye to the mounting evidence of corruption. But the most shocking revelation came when it was revealed that Copeland had personally ordered the alteration of financial records. One of his former assistants testified that he had been instructed to clean up records and to make things look right for the auditors. The details were horrifying. Donations meant for charity and ministry programs were being siphoned off, disguised as legitimate expenses, only to end up in Copeland's personal accounts. The allegations of financial fraud were bad enough, but things took a darker turn when new accusations emerged. Federal investigators began to uncover evidence suggesting that Copeland's ministry had been engaged in spiritual manipulation, coercing people into giving more money under the guise of divine instruction. Followers were told that if they donated large sums of money to the ministry, they would be blessed with prosperity in return. Some were even encouraged to empty their bank accounts and remortgage their homes, convinced that God would reward them tenfold for their faithful giving. The prosecution presented heartbreaking testimonies from people who had believed these promises. One woman, who had donated the entire life insurance payout from her deceased husband, tearfully explained how she had given everything she had to the ministry, thinking that it would be used for God's work. But instead, her money had gone toward funding Copeland's luxurious lifestyle. "I believed in him," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought I was sowing into something good. Instead, I have nothing. He took everything from me." And the truth continued to unfold. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered evidence of secret accounts and hidden properties, all purchased with the funds that were meant to go toward charitable causes. Copeland had been living a life of unimaginable luxury. Private jets, multi-million-dollar mansions, exclusive country clubs, and even a private airstrip, while convincing his followers to give up their hard-earned money in the name of faith. Former employees testified that they were told not to ask questions about where the money was going. "Don't question the man of God," one former financial officer said. If you did, you were told it was a sin. It was like questioning God himself. The pressure to stay silent was immense. As the case progressed, the walls closed in on Copeland. The prosecution presented more and more evidence, including shocking leaked documents that showed exactly how the financial manipulation was carried out. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a leaked memo from Copeland Ministries that outlined how personal expenses were to be disguised as ministry costs. According to the memo, Copeland had even instructed his staff to reclassify personal purchases as outreach expenses so that they could be tax deductible. It was an intricate web of deception, one that had been carefully planned and executed over the years. But despite all the mounting evidence, Copeland continued to deny any wrongdoing. He maintained that the money was all used for the ministry, for God's work, and that any accusations against him were just attempts to tear him down. But the truth was becoming undeniable. The evidence was clear. He had used his position as a man of God to manipulate, deceive, and steal from the very people who had trusted him. The courtroom was a spectacle, filled with gasps and murmurs as each new revelation hit the airwaves. Copeland's once ironclad reputation was crumbling before his eyes. His empire, built on faith, trust, and millions of dollars, was now a crumbling house of cards. The very followers who had once worshipped at his feet were beginning to question everything they had believed in. They had been deceived, manipulated, and robbed of their faith, their money, and in many cases their dignity. And as the trial reached its conclusion, it was clear that the consequences for Kenneth Copeland would be severe. He was facing not just financial ruin but personal disgrace. The man who had once stood tall, preaching about divine wealth and success, was now being held accountable for one of the most elaborate financial deceptions ever seen in religious broadcasting. His fall from grace was swift and brutal, leaving behind a trail of broken trust, shattered lives, and an empire that had been built on lies. As the courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the truth about Kenneth Copeland's rise to fame and his subsequent fall from grace began to unfold in ways that no one could have imagined. The man who had once stood as a giant in the world of televangelism, preaching about prosperity and divine favor, was now facing the consequences of a life built on lies. The shocking revelations of financial deception, hidden assets, and personal betrayals came pouring out, leaving the courtroom in stunned silence. Copeland had always presented himself as a man of faith, a servant of God who had devoted his life to spreading the message of hope and prosperity. For decades, he had been the face of the prosperity gospel movement, teaching millions of people that by giving generously to his ministry, they would receive blessings in return. His lavish lifestyle, complete with private jets, mansions, and luxurious vacations, was presented as a symbol of God's favor, proof that faith and financial success went hand in hand. But behind the scenes, things were far different. The first shocking revelation came when a former senior accountant from Copeland Ministries took the stand. The accountant had worked for Copeland for years, handling the ministry's finances, and had seen firsthand how the donations that were meant for God's work were being misused. "I was told not to ask questions," the former employee explained. "If money went missing, we were told it didn't matter. The ministry's needs were the priority, not where the money went." For years, this employee had been complicit in a system that was designed to hide Copeland's lavish personal expenses from the public eye. The accountant went on to explain how Copeland had used donations meant for ministry programs to fund his own luxurious lifestyle. Private jets, multi-million-dollar homes, and even personal shopping sprees were paid for using money that had been donated by faithful followers, who believed they were investing in God's work. It was a well-oiled machine, the accountant testified. The money went in, and Copeland made sure it came back out in the form of personal luxury. The evidence was staggering. Court documents revealed that Copeland had personally signed off on the diversion of millions of dollars from ministry accounts into secret offshore accounts and personal investments. He had used these funds to purchase property, luxury cars, and even fund vacations at exclusive resorts. As the details of his financial scheme were laid out for the court, it became clear that Copeland's empire was built not on faith and good works, but on deception and greed. But the revelations didn't stop there. As the trial continued, more former employees took the stand, each one sharing their own stories of betrayal and manipulation. One former member of Copeland's ministry team spoke about the intimidation tactics used by Copeland and his inner circle. "We were told that questioning Copeland was like questioning God," the employee explained. "If you didn't fall in line, you were fired." People were too scared to speak out. The atmosphere within Copeland Ministries was one of fear and control, with anyone who dared to challenge the status quo being silenced through threats or intimidation. Perhaps the most devastating testimony came from a former senior pastor who had worked with Copeland for over 20 years. This individual had once been a trusted member of Copeland's inner circle, someone who had believed in the ministry and its mission. But as the years went on, he began to notice things that didn't sit right with him. "I trusted him," the pastor said, his voice breaking. "We all did. We believed we were doing God's work, but the truth is we were being used. We were robbing people of their hard-earned money, all while telling them they had to give more." The pastor's words sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Here was a man who had stood by Copeland's side for 2 decades, preaching the same message, only to be betrayed by the very person he had considered a mentor. It was a betrayal of the highest order, one that left the pastor questioning everything he had once believed in. As he looked Copeland in the eye, he couldn't hold back the tears. "I can't live with this anymore," he said. "The truth has to come out." And the truth kept coming. As the prosecution dug deeper, they uncovered evidence of even more personal betrayals. One particularly heart-wrenching testimony came from a widow who had donated her late husband's entire life insurance payout to Copeland's ministry, believing that it would be used for charitable purposes. "I believed in him," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He told us that if we gave with faith, God would reward us. I gave everything I had, everything my husband left me, because I trusted him, and now I have nothing. He took it all." The courtroom fell silent as the woman's words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the real human cost of Copeland's deception. It was clear that Copeland's financial misconduct had far-reaching consequences. Lives had been ruined, families had been destroyed, and the very people who had believed in him the most were left with nothing but regret. As more former employees and ministry members took the stand, the full scale of Copeland's manipulation became even more apparent. It wasn't just about money, it was about power. Copeland had built an empire not on the teachings of Christ, but on the exploitation of his followers' faith. The final betrayal, however, came from within Copeland's own family. For years, his wife, Gloria Copeland, had stood by his side, preaching the same message of prosperity and financial success. But as the trial progressed, it became clear that even she could no longer defend her husband. After decades of public support, Gloria filed for divorce, citing a need to separate herself from past actions and focus on her own spiritual journey. This final act of abandonment left Copeland utterly alone, with his family, his ministry, and his wealth all slipping through his fingers. As the trial neared its conclusion, Kenneth Copeland's fall from grace seemed complete. The man who had once stood at the top of the televangelist world, commanding millions of dollars in donations and living a life of unimaginable luxury, was now facing the harsh reality of his actions. His empire had crumbled, his followers had turned their backs on him, and his family had abandoned him. The once great preacher was now nothing more than a shell of his former self, surrounded by the wreckage of his own greed and deceit. And so, as the courtroom doors closed behind him, Kenneth Copeland's fate was sealed. He was no longer the face of prosperity and divine favor. Instead, he had become a symbol of the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of betraying the trust of those who had believed in him. The shocking revelations and personal betrayals that had emerged during the trial had forever changed the legacy of Kenneth Copeland. What was once a ministry built on faith and hope had now become a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the power of deception and the price of ambition gone wrong. Kenneth Copeland's fall from grace was swift, brutal, and public. For decades, he had built a massive empire, thriving in the world of televangelism. He preached prosperity, promising his followers that faith could bring wealth, success, and divine favor. His ministry was a beacon of luxury and opulence, with private jets, sprawling estates, and a lifestyle most could only dream of. But all of that came crashing down once the truth about his financial misconduct was uncovered. When the sentencing finally came, it marked the end of an era. The man who had once been a towering figure in Christian broadcasting now stood convicted, facing the consequences of his actions. It was in the courtroom, the place where many of the lies had been exposed, that Copeland's world truly unraveled. The sentence was handed down, and as the judge pronounced the verdict, guilty on all charges of fraud, tax evasion, and misappropriation of charitable funds, Copeland's knees buckled, and his once unshakable confidence faltered. His hands, which had once confidently gripped the microphone in front of millions, trembled as he gripped the edge of the courtroom table. The collapse was not just physical, but emotional. Copeland, known for his fiery sermons and unwavering faith, had spent years convincing his followers that his wealth was a sign of divine favor, that prosperity was proof of God's blessing. But now, standing before the court, the truth was undeniable. His empire had been built on the backs of people who had given their hard-earned money, believing in a lie. For a man who had lived so large, the reality of his fall from grace was more than he could bear. As security rushed to his side, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, but the once proud televangelist was now powerless. His collapse signified the finality of his downfall. A man who had spent decades convincing people to believe in him was now forced to face the harsh consequences of his actions. His empire was crumbling, his wealth seizing up, and the ministry he had spent his life building was being dismantled, piece by piece. Articles of appeal were provided by the government for persons connected to Lamley inquiries about how Aesop would, and who would, sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison. Copeland's life as he knew it was over. Gone were the golden microphones, the luxurious jets, and the thousands of devoted followers who once hung on every word he said. What remained was a man who had to come to terms with the brutal reality of what he had done. In the days following his sentencing, Copeland was taken into custody, and his world was reduced to a cold, sterile prison cell. His once powerful name had become synonymous with scandal and deceit, a far cry from the prosperity gospel he had preached so fervently for years. In prison, life was a far cry from the life he had once known. The guards, once people he could charm and control, now saw him as just another inmate. The bright lights, the adoration, the power he had wielded, everything had been stripped away. Copeland tried to maintain the illusion of control. He still had a certain presence, a need to lead, a desire to preach, but in this new world, his words fell on deaf ears. There were no adoring fans to listen, no cameras capturing his every movement. Instead, he was just another inmate, trying to navigate life behind bars. His first attempts to preach were met with mockery. Fellow inmates, who had no interest in hearing sermons, made their disdain clear. "Where's your private jet now, preacher?" one of them sneered as Copeland tried to rally a small group. The reality of his fall was harsh. His once commanding presence now felt hollow in the face of mockery. Inmates who had no patience for a man who had exploited his followers for personal gain had little respect for his sermons. As the days turned into weeks, Copeland retreated into himself. The man who had once controlled every aspect of his life now found himself utterly powerless. His prison life was mundane and routine, a far cry from the extravagant lifestyle he had once enjoyed. He no longer had special privileges. His meals were the same as the other inmates. His daily life consisted of labor, routine prison tasks, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. Gone were the days of preaching to millions, of sitting in front of a camera and convincing the world that faith equaled wealth. Now he spent his days in the stark silence of his prison cell, contemplating a life that had crumbled beyond recognition.